Hello everyone, I'm Caitlin Teeter, and on today's Teeter Tales, I'm going to be doing a review of The Mythmakers by John Hendricks. The Mythmakers is a nonfiction sort of graphic novel. The subtitle of the book is The Remarkable Fellowship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, which pretty much tells you what the book is about. It's a nonfiction work about C.S. Lewis and Tolkien's friendship. This review will be a little different than the others on my channel because this is a primarily non-fictional work and it relies very heavily on visual elements. As such, I'm going to have sections of this review where I talk about both of those elements. I also want to mention that going into this book, I knew quite a bit about Tolkien as an individual, but not much about Lewis and not much about their relationship. Let's go ahead and get started with the review. This book is classified by my library as a graphic novel, and I'm not convinced that that's an entirely accurate classification. In some instances, the book reads very much like a graphic novel with how many images that it has. Here is one such example of that. At other points in the book, it is much more of a standard nonfiction piece that just has a few accompanying illustrations to go along with it, as seen here. Either way, this book does rely on both its textual and visual elements to create a cohesive whole. The book begins by walking the reader through what a myth is and the various stories that inspire both Tolkien and Lewis. After this initial chapter, the book then goes into the pair's lives in chronological order, taking time to address both Tolkien and Lewis and then bringing them together. While the book does address their personal lives, it is very much focused on how these two men met, influenced, and supported each other, and then later how they drifted apart. I'll admit, initially I was a bit skeptical of the art in this book. Pages rely on just a few colors to convey the image and often only show partial pictures, so I wasn't immediately sold on the art style. However, as I continued to read, it grew on me. The color schemes throughout the book actually work very well. The first few pages have a light golden hue that gives a sense of warmth and promise. But then as you are taken through the halls of myth, the pages are dark with just highlights of gold. Tolkien and Lewis's childhoods are drawn with light pinks, purples, and yellows, but as they transition into wartime, the pages grow darker and brown. This does an excellent job of setting the tone for each chapter in their lives. As for the images themselves, I came to understand that the images and text were working together, not competing against each other. I did feel that some sections could have been shortened. I'll get into that more in the narrative devices section of this review. The artwork often helped control the pacing of this book. Pages that relied heavily on images often served as setting the tone for the following section. Those with very little imagery used the artwork as an accent, such as the page depicting Lewis's extraction from the war. There were also some truly stunning pieces of artwork throughout this book that are pleasing just from an artistic perspective. There were full-page spreads like this one, and then there was some great framing with the art, such as this chessboard look. There were also some images that served as a backdrop for chunks of text. By the end of this book, I found that I really enjoyed the art in it. I'm not the best judge of accuracy for this book. As I mentioned before, I know very little about C.S. Lewis and not much about Tolkien regarding his relationship with Lewis. However, I can comment on how the information is presented and if it seemed misleading in any way. Hendricks seems to have done an excellent job of both noting when he's giving a direct quotation and citing his sources. A note at the very beginning of the book says that an asterisk will mark any time a direct quotation is used, the sources of which can be found at a very neatly organized index at the back of the book. This is very useful as I like to see where all the quotes were coming from, but it will also be helpful for future reading that I might do on this topic. As for fabricated information, Hendricks seems to have done his best to avoid giving the wrong impression of his subjects. Hendricks does include comic panels of people having conversations, but he has a note at the start of the book saying that these conversations are speculative and he thinks they could have happened based on other things that the people have said. And again, he does mark any true quotations within these conversations with an asterisk. Despite all the facts, this is still very much a narrative, and it kept me wanting to read more. Chronological telling really helped with this, but there were many quotes that helped get into the mind of Lewis and Tolkien. The end of this book was where things really started to get fictitious. Without going into spoilers, Hendrix essentially plays guesswork on how Lewis and Tolkien felt about each other at the end of their lives. While this works very well from a storytelling perspective and makes for an emotional end to the book, this was the only point where I felt the book may have strayed too far into the realm of fiction. Again, my storytelling brain loved it, but my factual brain was a bit skeptical. This book was way more engaging than I thought it would be. While the first section was a bit slow and felt almost geared towards a younger audience, the book really improved once it actually reached Tolkien and Lewis. Though I knew that their stories had come to a close in the 1900s, I was still very invested to see how their relationship would change over time. I found myself feeling bad for their challenging childhoods, happy for their time they spent creating together, and sad when their friendship began to fall apart. Part of this could be linked to me being a big Tolkien fan, but I think much of this can be attributed to Hendrix's storytelling capabilities. This book is written from the perspective of a Tolkien and Lewis fan for Tolkien and Lewis fans. While I think that someone who's not interested in this pair could still enjoy this book and find it interesting, there are a lot of little references that are best suited for those who have some familiarity with their works. This may sound like an odd category, but I felt this was a better term for the discussion than characters. I want to spend some time talking about the roles of Wizard and Mr. Lion in this book, who are these characters you can see on the cover. When I started this book, I was honestly annoyed by their presence. They're essentially the reader's guides through this book, and they'll often provide any outside knowledge that's required on the topics discussed. For example, the opening chapter covers myths and various other kinds of storytelling. These two characters walk the reader through these concepts, with Mr. Lion being the one to make personal connections, and Wizard serving as the academic. It's hard for me to say if their use improved in the book as it went along, or if they simply grew on me. I found them annoying and a bit childish at first, but after a few chapters, I enjoyed how they were a means of providing narrative structure and insight. Now I'll get into some spoilers for the end of the book, so if you don't want spoilers for how Hendrix uses these two as a narrative device at the end of the book, you should go ahead and skip to the next section of my review. Now we'll get into the spoiler. At the end of this book, Mr. Lion and Wizard essentially become Lewis and Tolkien, respectively. I had very mixed feelings on this ending. Again, from a storytelling point of view, it works very well. It provides a chance for the pair to have a last conversation and look back over their lives. But at the same time, this book has been about Tolkien and Lewis's lives as they were, not as they could have been, and not fabricating a fiction around them. Hendrix, in his note at the end of the book, even says as much and goes into detail on why he chose to end the book this way, so I'll go ahead and read that note. Perhaps it should go without saying, but the conversations between Mr. Lion and Wizard, including the ending where they serve as avatars for Lewis and Tolkien, are fictional. Though details of Wizard's and Mr. Lion's personalities are based on biographical details of our protagonists, their conclusions are ultimately my own. Any reflection by these guides about the inner thoughts and states of mind of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, though based on research, are broadly speculative. In many ways, the friendship of Lewis and Tolkien was both a triumph and a tragedy. Their fellowship was never fully restored before Lewis's death. Yet in this book's retelling, I very much wanted to give readers the kind of happily ever after that all fairy tales need. The last conversation that Lewis and Tolkien have in this book is not based on any documentation. Without downplaying the severity of their estrangement in later life, this scene reflects Tolkien's hopes of escape, recovery, and consolation found in his work on fairy stories. Their final meeting is a metaphor for the larger restoration and reconciling of all things that Christians believe is waiting through the threshold of the new heaven and the new earth. After reading this note, I do believe that I understand what Hendrix was going for with these two characters in the end of the book, and considering what his goal was, I think he was mostly successful. However, I still have mixed feelings on how Mr. Lion and Wizard were used in a work that's primarily meant to be nonfiction. there's not a whole lot to say about the content of this book. Since it's nonfiction and focused on a pretty tame subject, there's not much to worry about, but I will mention a few moments that stood out to me. There's a section in this book dedicated to describing Tolkien and Lewis's time in World War I. This likely won't be a problem for anyone but very young or very sensitive readers, but it will describe things such as trench fever being carried by lice, corpses being strewn between the trenches, which is accompanied with some disturbing illustrations, and how soldiers would be vaporized by shells exploding on them. I do think that there were maybe a couple quotes that had mild profanities in them, but nothing beyond that. And as for the spiritual side of things, the book does explore Lewis's early atheism and later the tensions over Tolkien's Catholicism and Lewis's Protestantism. I was very excited to read this book and it did not disappoint. While I wasn't immediately hooked, the book quickly picked things up after the first section. Again, I am biased because this was a topic I was already very interested in, but I think Hendricks does a great job of conveying a lot of information in a very engaging way. Combining facts with his artwork, he creates a very narrative-driven book that explores the lives of Tolkien and Lewis, and by the end asks readers how the story might apply to their own lives. I would highly recommend this book to anyone who is interested in Tolkien and or Lewis, or even someone who just has an interest in combining visual and textual storytelling and creative nonfiction. I hope that this review was helpful and that you'll consider reading The Mythmakers. Thanks for watching. Bye!